Great.
Let me introduce our speaker and say and welcome everyone. So this is the first Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series talk of 2021. Before I introduce our speaker, Aaron, let me just give a brief preview of next week. So January 11th, same time, same place, we're going to have Professor Evelina Fedorenko from MIT, and her talk is going to be called The Human Language System in the Mind and Brain. So today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Aaron Panofsky from the UCLA Institute of Society and Genetics and Department of Sociology. It's a great pleasure to welcome Aaron today, and his talk is going to be called Citizen Scientific Racism from Dissident Professionals to Public Participation. Welcome, Aaron, and let me hold on. Let me invite everyone to, if you'd like to unmute yourself for a second, to join me in welcoming Aaron Panofsky. Okay, go ahead, Aaron. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. I have a slightly different title than the one that I circulated. It's almost the same. I kind of bounce back and forth between these two titles, I'm not exactly sure.
I was reading off the announcement. So
yes, right. So I just wanted to say, when people are reading this and seeing it different, that's what's going on. Part of it is, you know, we can get into this in the discussion. Another audience that I gave this to emphasize they weren't so sure about how scientific some of the things that the white nationalists are doing are, and so they wanted to talk about it as appropriations rather than public participation. And so anyway, this might be an interesting topic for us to discuss at the end, because I think part of the sort of punchline or the story is the way that the boundaries of science become muddled in this case study. And present certain problems of both interpretation and politics for people like us and people who are interested in thinking about genetics and evolution of behavior, and what it means for the public. And so, okay, so I'm going to give this talk on behalf of myself and two postdoctoral scholars that I've been working with, Kushan Dasgupta and Nicole Iturriaga. And so let me jump in. So, oh wait, hold on, wrong window. Okay, there we go. So, so on the one hand, we're used to thinking of scientific racism in terms of a sort of cadre of dissident professional scientists who work on, who have made claims about basically the genetic reality of race and evidence for genetic explanations for racial differences in behavior, especially intelligence, but also things like personality differences, differences towards disposition towards civilization, differences in what would you call it, sort of like executive control function and disposition towards violence or aggression, things like that. And we usually think of it as sort of a set of individual people who are, at least in the recent past, people who work on things like IQ, behavioral genetics, and some kind of evolutionary anthropology, also psychology and so forth. And so here's sort of a list of some individuals that probably all of you are aware of, who, though they are often controversial because people think that they have both a combination of sort of mainstream and more provocative contributions to science. It's that muddling of the two between sort of mainstream contributions. For example, Arthur Jensen is a widely respected psychometrician and theorist of IQ. And so if you're an IQ researcher, even if you are totally uninterested in race, you have to contend with the kinds of ideas that Arthur Jensen has had net of the race question, but then he's also made a large contribution to questions about racial differences. And I think the same is true for almost everyone on this list. And there are others that I could highlight. So that's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation in my talk is to talk about this movement of citizen science or public participation in science. And we usually think of citizen science or public participation in science as a set of relationships to change, or a set of changing relationships between sort of an ivory tower science and a lay public. So one version of this is that scientists engage lay people to further research and promote understanding. Other versions of this are like maybe you see in the picture in the center of the ACT UP movement, a movement that have tried to exploit fissures in science and to draw experts to consider their own problems. This has also happened in environmental health movements and so forth. And they're often seen as ways for lay people to develop versions of scientific expertise in order to make demands on the state or capital. Here I have, business community and so forth to further meet their needs. And this is often framed in terms of the democratization of knowledge and the more just distribution of the fruits of science, right? So there's a wide range of research on citizen science, and that's kind of where a lot of it lands. Our case study here that we're going to talk about today, or that I'm going to talk about today, in some ways kind of overturns both the assumption about scientific racism and the assumption about citizen science. So our argument is that ordinary people, much more than professional scientists today, are engaged in education and research to make the case for racial realism and to make the case that white supremacy has a scientific basis, meaning the idea that intellectual differences, behavioral differences, civilizational differences between racial groups, such as they may be, have a scientific basis. That these sets of claims are largely made by a citizen movement. That this movement has filled a vacuum, as professional science has, and I think haltingly and incompletely, but yet progressively worked to delegitimate racism as a legitimate scientific topic. But this is not a democratic movement. This is a movement aiming to appropriate science towards distinctly and strongly anti-democratic and anti-egalitarian ends. And finally, I think our case study is going to highlight some of the dilemmas of open science, the push towards open science that I think many scientists have been very enthusiastic about and interested in as a means to increase the integrity and relevance of natural science. Okay, so that's kind of the background. And so we might ask whether is science actually less racist? So I think one of the critiques and sometimes some pushback I get when I talk about this topic is that we say that, that lots of people think science is still highly racist and highly white supremacist, and that, the pipeline for having scholars of color is slow, even as we're trying to build it. It's slower than most people want it to be. And there are still, lots of, it seems that racist ideas are still promulgated among scientists. And to that, I would sort of say, on the one hand, so you have folks like this, Jensen, Rushton, and others, but a lot of these guys have passed away. And on some of the other ones, I feel like the clock is ticking, right? So they're very, and so this is kind of glib, maybe mean-spirited in some ways, but the idea here is that that I think that within science, many of the purveyors of scientific racist ideas the clock is ticking on them. They're very old, and they're not being reproduced within the academy at anything like a replacement rate. And so that's one hand. So on the supply side is getting lower, and then also within science, there's been less tolerance of explicit racism. So on the one hand, Watson, even though there's been sort of fits and starts about Jim Watson after he has sort of repeatedly over the years said provocative things about people of African descent having less capability and less intelligence, but he has finally kind of been discredited and pushed aside, at least for that part of his agenda. When Nicholas Wade wrote the book troublesome inheritance that tried to draw from the field of population genetics to make arguments that that the reason why there's civilizational differences between Europe and the rest of the world is mostly or largely explainable in genetic terms. This book was denounced by 150 geneticists who said that this is not an adequate and accurate representation of our field. When Bruce Lawn, a geneticist, made his provocative claims about the evolution of microcephalism and other genetic genes that might explain the capacity of European and Asians to leave Africa and the cognitive revolution that they supposedly wrought. This was systematically and fairly quietly, but systematically dismantled by these set of claims by the genetics discipline. And this is, I think, a strong contrast with the 1994 bell curve area with, we have Charles Murray there, where most geneticists refused to engage the bell curve and hoped it would go away, and they wanted to pass over it in silence. And actually there's some evidence, some folks, there's been some stories that Watson actually suppressed efforts to when he was the head of the Human Genome Project, to address and confront the bell curve at the time. So it's not that era anymore. And I think that there's a flurry of activity even since I first developed this talk. So this is a new slide. Against race psychology, even this year, right? So, Elsevier retracted a provocative article by Philip Rushton that was trying to argue that pigmentation was related to aggressiveness and sexual libido in humans. So darker skin led to more violence and more sexuality. So Elsevier retracted that paper just recently. That's a 2012 paper, retracted just a couple months ago. They also retracted a different journal. Oh, this is too small for me to read at this moment. I forgot. It's Psychological Reports. Retracted a couple Rushton papers. Rushton's department convened and wrote a sort of a reconciliation and denunciation of his profile this summer. Now, some people would say that's 8 or more years too late, but it did happen this summer. It's not just Rushton, but also Richard Lind has had, who is, I didn't have any pictures of him, but Richard Lind is notorious, and he'll come up again later in this talk, but he's notorious for talking about national IQ and genetic differences in national IQ levels. And he's actually written very explicitly in favor of eugenics, written a couple books about eugenics and why it's good. But he lost his emeritus status from the Ulster University and has had several of his papers flagged for sort of editorial concerns. Okay, so there's been a flurry of activity against race psychology in 2020. And the anthropologist Jonathan Marks wrote in his recent short manifesto, Is Science Racist? That, in this short book, he writes that science is still racist insofar as racial genetics claims are tolerated as a legitimate question, right? And he does this elaborate comparison in his book, or not elaborate, but actually a very sort of straightforward comparison of the tolerance for racial hereditary research in contrast to the lack of tolerance for creationist research. And he sort of says, why is there a double standard within science for these two topics? And he develops an argument about how science has tolerated one but not the other, even though the evidentiary grounds are very similar. And so his argument is that, science is still racist insofar as it's tolerating these kinds of hypotheses and questions. And I guess what I'm trying to argue here is that there is a movement, right? There's a strong movement that science is trying to kind of reconcile with this and say that this is not a legitimate topic, and it's happening in a number of different fields. Okay, so let me swing over again to scientific racism's relationship to social movements. So now, before 1950, there's lots of historical research about the relationship between the eugenics movement and scientific racism of that era and early 20th century and before, that talks about lots of quite a trading zone between scientific racism and racist social movements or racist sort of political ideologies. But since the 1950s or something, there has still been I think that the relationship between white nationalism or far right political movements and science has changed, arguably. Okay, and so in a good book by Tucker, Science and the Politics of IQ, his argument was that in the mid 20th century, there was an occasional appeal by segregationist movements to science for support, but it was kind of in a mode where science and the segregationist movements were fairly separate. And so the movements would kind of appeal and sort of say, see, the scientists are proving what we have always known to be true, and that was good enough for them. And then they could just sort of go on and advocate for their segregationism. And so the argument, I think, is that there is sort of a growing separation between scientific movements and scientific claims about racial differences and social movements who might be interested in those claims, right? That there's kind of a parallel, separate track. And much of the more contemporary historiography on white nationalism, such as Catherine Ballou's book, other books about white nationalist movements from Catherine Blee and others, there's another person I'm blanking on right now, have argued that there's lots of ideological components to white nationalism, but science is not really part of it. So a lot of it is about anti-government ideologies. A lot of it is about anti-Semitism, but anti-Semitism in a cultural and political sense. But there's very little need to justify these far-right movements in the mid 20th century, late 20th century, in terms of scientific appeals to science. And my sort of claim is that David Duke's My Awakening, which appeared in, oh goodness, I should have written this down. I think it appeared in the very early 90s, was a kind of transitional moment back to start to think, for white nationalists to start thinking about science again. So David Duke, of course, was a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan in Louisiana, and in the early 90s, late 80s, he started to run for political office, and he got elected to a state legislative position, and he went pretty far in a Senate run in Louisiana, and then it didn't work out. And I think he ran for president as well at one point. But when you look at his memoir, My Awakening, it's basically half memoir and half lit review, and it's an extensive review of the psychological and genetic evidence, insofar as he interprets it, in support of racial realism and racial hereditarian ideas about hierarchies and justification for why miscegenation is bad, and why white people need to be on top but are always at risk of getting racially diluted and eugenically diluted, and so forth. And so the trope of the book is really how a liberal egalitarian, he portrays himself as sort of an unthinking liberal egalitarian as a youth, and that he starts to read the racial science, and then that converts him to a hard-nosed racist white nationalist who finally is awakened to the reality of race. Okay, and so my argument is that this movement towards inserting science as a justification of your racist ideology, it sort of takes off at this point and has accelerated since then. Okay, so my question so David Duke, though, still was like reading books and then processing them and applying them to his own life and his own ideology, but he wasn't doing science, right? He still had a very passive relationship to the scientific literature as a consumer, a pure consumer. And so my question is, what are citizen scientific racists' practices today? Okay, and that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk. So what I identify in this talk are sort of 5 domains. of increasingly, so as you go down the list there, you get increasingly intensive relationships between what the citizen scientific races and what I'm calling citizen scientific racists, or white nationalists who are appropriating science, get increasingly intensive as we move down the list. From the top, where it's basically a consumption and propagation relationship, to the bottom, where it is a doing science and generating new knowledge that purports to be contributions to hereditarian ideas about to the hereditarian corpus of knowledge. And so we go down this, as we go down this list, we go up in terms of the intensification. And I'll just have a quick side note that there's some disturbing images that follow. And, you know, obviously the images, they're not, certainly not the worst ones that are out there, but they're presented for exemplification purposes only. And I don't want this to be a kind of platform for what they're trying to do or to legitimate it in any way. Okay, so I'm going to start out with the first step here, which is racist science journalism. Okay, so there are substantial, let me move my thing off my picture there. Okay, so there's substantial attention in the far right in a series of online magazines, essentially, such as the American Renaissance, the UNS Review, and VDare, and there are several others. Tacky's magazine is another one. And there's substantial attention in far-right online magazines to issues of science, right? So you can see in all of these that there's, so this first one by American Renaissance is a review by Jared Taylor of Charles Murray's recent book, Human Diversity. And the UNS Review things here, you can see there's a whole section on science and technology, and there's many different, if you look at the top, there's many different kind of science-related, science-adjacent topics. And there's just lots of coverage of science issues that they say are fundamentally about race and racism, or race and racial differences. Lots of attention to genetics, biology, and psychology. And this is sort of science journalism in the sense that we normally think about it, but it's strongly focused on questions of race. And there's a cadre of sort of correspondents who have dedicated substantial attention and detailed discussion to these issues. And so people like Jared Taylor of American Renaissance, Stephen Seiler of VDare, but they also kind of write in each other's spheres too, that do these detailed, lengthy explainers and appropriations of published scientific reports and other published science journalism, and then they're sort of excerpted and digested, and the sort of white nationalist tenets are propagated for their audiences, right? And this greatly outpaces any attention on the left to science and policy. So if you went and read, you know, Jacobin magazine or something, there would be tons of social science discussion, tons of policy discussion, but there would be no genetics, there'd be no anthropology, and no psychology for the most part. Okay. So that's the first stage. The next step in intensity is what I call the kind of extremely online activity of the alt-right. And so this is the circulation of ideas in discussion boards and online forums such as 4chan, 8chan, Reddit, Stormfront, which is a white nationalist discussion board, Gab, and Twitter. Gab is sort of the right-wing version of Twitter, a lot of blogs and so forth, in which memes, tweets, comments, sort of little kind of harassments and jokes, Gamergate, Paper the Frog, there's this long sort of set of symbols and ideas that use genetics, psychology, and hereditarian ideas about essential racial differences to explain the politics and policy positions of the nationalist right. And so this animates now for a second, but Amy Harmon of the New York Times, these screenshots are from her October 17, 2018, this large expose that came out just before the American Conference for the American Human Genetics Society came out, and basically she revealed that all this stuff was going on, that there are all these these white nationalist appropriations of genetic ideas, and basically she pitched to the geneticists, well, what are you going to do about this? That's what these, I can show the image again. So that's what the tweets show. The one in the upper center shows a bunch of white nationalist guys. So the image here is a bunch of white nationalist guys with their shirts off, chugging milk. And this is so it seems weird, right? And they're at this sort of alt-right rally, and it's kind of an arch statement, but on the one hand, the symbolism of milk is, of course, that it's pure and it's white. But also, it's a claim about lactose tolerance, right, and lactase persistence, and their argument is that well, lactase is basically a European mutation, and it is what makes Europeans able to digest milk and cheese, and this is part of our cultural and biological inheritance. And so they're kind of trolling the world by chugging milk and making this argument about that this is part of what makes white people white, is their ability to drink milk. And of course, it turns out it's not true, right? There are other populations that have co-evolved the capacity to have lactase persistence, but nevertheless, this is an appropriation that they've done. Okay, and so the culture and affordances of these venues of this sort of extremely online activity lead to a particular style of discourse, which is typically short, direct, ironic, insult-laden snippets of argument. And those of you who are on Twitter, I don't personally follow Twitter as a personal academic practice, but others of you who do so probably have encountered or run across some of this stuff, where it's these sort of short, direct, ironic, insult-laden snippets of argument that get scattered about and often wedded to these memes that have this connection to science. And so here's some of the memes. I'll just give you a little bit closer look about the ways that science is often used, memes circulated in support of racial realism. So on the left, you see this picture of, some early 20th century or late 19th century picture of the anthropologist visiting people in a pygmy village or a bushman village, and to this image is wedded the phrase "race is a social construct." LOL. Does anyone really believe this nonsense? The truth is that race is biologically real. In the middle, you have a set of analogous comparisons. So you have like an elk and a deer or something. I don't really know what they are, but sort of an elk and a deer, and it says these are different species. And then you have a chimp and a gorilla, and it says these are two different species. But then you have at the bottom a woman from an African tribe and Beethoven, and then it says, but they're totally the same species, right? So these animals that look almost the same are different species. But these humans that look utterly different and are behaviorally at this incredible spectrum, is the implication, are the same. And the iron, and so that what they're saying is like, that's absurd. Okay, this can't be true. And I've seen a similar meme where FST calculations are used to make the same point, where they talk about the FST scores for a wolf and for apes, and then for humans, and they sort of say, look, this doesn't make sense. And then the one on the right is basically another practice where the images from scientific papers will be extracted, relabeled, and then circulated in support of racial realism. So this image on the right, is from Need et al. 2009. And it's a study of the genetics of self-identified Jewish individuals as a principal component analysis that looks at genetic variation and then tries to cluster the individuals in terms of genetic similarity. And then, but what the white nationalists have done have relabeled the clusters with these sort of provocative statements, provocative labels: Gentiles, half Jews, full Jews, almost Jews, and quadroon Jews. And so the idea here is to demonstrate, on the one hand, the genetic distinctiveness and the identifiability of Jewish people, right? That Jews can be called out and separated from non-Jews using genetic technologies, which might be useful in a white nationalist future, political future. But secondly, to impose ideas of hypodescent upon Jewish people, right? To say that there's kind of a one-drop rule going on where you can trace how many drops of Jewish blood a person has using these genetic technologies. And obviously, and this is also the same technology that things like 23andMe use. The story here is that Jews are also a problem of miscegenation, right? That the intermarriage with Jews is trackable in a genetic way and can be identified, right? And so the story of all these pictures is that racial difference is plain, it stares you in the face, and that things like unequal racial distributions are a basic fact, and the graphical distributions of genetic variations cluster into obvious racial and ethnic blobs, and you'd have to be completely blinded by social justice egalitarianism and a multicultural ideology, as they will obnoxiously point out, to see these facts in any other way, right? And so that's sort of the point of this sort of extremely online circulation of these images, right? To take them out of one context and put them into a context where racial realism stares you in the face and is undeniable. Okay, so now I'm going to move to the next venue of genetic ancestry testing, and as I just mentioned before, this is the same technology that of principal component analysis and supervised version of principal component analysis to identify individuals in terms of the components of ancestry that make them up, and then to sort of sell that back to them as a recreational tool. And so in an earlier study that I worked on was about what white nationalists do when they get these genetic ancestry results from Ancestry.com or 23andMe, and find out that they have some kind of anomalous non-white genetic ancestry. And the kind of activities that I document in that paper are, on the one hand, they engage in repair activities for anomalous results. And so, so the quote here is that they say things like, the main flaw when someone might show up with some Turkish DNA, and then they say, whoa, does that mean I'm not white? The main flaw is that they base your results on a common DNA segment. A Greek taking the test might come back as Turk, not because he has Turkish ancestry, but because some Turks have Greek ancestry. And so what they're highlighting there in that argument is about a spurious genetic correlation, right? That a link between you and a particular group that you're not that interested in might be not because you're linked to that group, but because the genetic ancestry company has misidentified the direction of causation, the direction of ancestry. And this is the kind of critique that's actually a very sophisticated critique that many anthropologists, sociologists, and historians have made of these genetic ancestry testing companies, right? From an anti-racial essentialist point of view. And this is being used, this kind of argument is not necessarily being appropriated, but is being intuited by the white nationalists to repair anomalous results and say that, well, you're not really, if you get some bad data that seems to suggest you're not white, that's not necessarily true. So some of their activities are related to things like repairing anomalous results, but it's not all about interpreting these results and trying to explain them away. They also engage in rethinking the boundaries and the hierarchies of whiteness, right? So rather than thinking about, well, what makes a white person, and sort of saying, well, it's a person who looks white, acts white, and who we know that their grandparents are white, they'll say things like, well, maybe we should redefine whiteness, or some will argue, at least in these circles, what if your point on a principal component analysis diagram falls in the white cluster, you're white. If it falls outside the white cluster, you're not white. So it's some rethinking of what it might mean to be white using genetic technologies and thinking ahead. Okay, well, how might white nationalism incorporate this genetics in order to help us identify who's genuinely white and part of the white nationalist future? And so they also encourage people to do things like download their data from 23andMe and upload it to other services such as GED Match, which has more refined tools for interrogating and analyzing your genetic data, or to Promethease, which is another online resource where you can track the mutations you have and what kind of disease or behavioral correlations those genes might come up with. And so the idea here that I want to point out is that that these the use of genetic ancestry tests is not just confirming people's prior views about race, but is also, by white nationalists, being embedded in a kind of racialist cognition to rethink what it might mean to be white and to debate some of the boundaries and conditions of whiteness, right? So they're grappling with what genetic ancestry tests make visible, and then trying to contend with that new reality. But at the same time, they're not sort of taking the message that 23andMe markets itself on, which is, hey, take a genetic ancestry test and learn about your common connection to all of humanity and become less racist in the result, right? Which is the way that these tests are usually marketed. And so, right, so the prior sort of racialist cognition of white nationalists connected to what these genetic ancestry tests make visible sort of empower a racialist cognition, I argue. And I didn't mention this. I'm sorry. I should roll back and just say where we looked at this these data were on the white nationalist discussion board Stormfront, where we combed through all the discussions of where people said, "Hey, post your genetic ancestry test results and let's talk about it." So these are analyses of those discussions. And you'll see on the right here, a common, this is a tweet from Richard Spencer, the notorious alt-right figure who came into prominence right around the time that, that Donald Trump was first running for office. And he posts his 23andMe results and saying, this is my ancestry, right? So he sees this genetic result as legitimating his sort of leadership of the white nationalist movement. Okay. Now, this isn't only an American phenomenon, and I won't go into this in much detail. This isn't my research, but a researcher named Claude Olivier Doron, who actually a year ago at UCLA presented this, I guess now almost 2 years ago, presented these results, where he basically argues that there's a thriving industry in Europe of Euro-nationalist culture, ancestry, and identity hobbyists who have used different genetic evidence to write kind of papers and make arguments and write blogs about who is the most European, right? Is it the Mediterraneans? Are they most authentically European? Or is it the Nordics, the Nords or the Meds? Right, and there are these different debates among European sort of nationalist and hobbyist communities, bringing up this question, and they often engage in very sophisticated reanalyses of data in which they'll sort of download data sets and write their own ancestry papers about these different forms of European nationalism. Right, so just as a side note that this isn't only an American phenomenon. Okay. So now I'm going to go to the next level of appropriation, which is what I would call the human biodiversity movement, or I don't call it the human biodiversity movement. They do, but this is the next group. And so human biodiversity is, as they identify themselves from their Reddit page, the study of human genetics and how they are responsible for our inclinations, behaviors, preferences, abilities, intelligence, lifespan, and other attributes. Human biological diversity starts from the perspective that genetics is the cause and behaviors are the effect, even if we're all in denial of how little control we have of ourselves. And so the idea here is they're basically a group of hereditarian amateurs who have collected and gathered a wide amount of hereditarian information about some of it's about race, but some of it's just about hereditary perspectives on behavior more generally. And they have gathered this into an encyclopedic resource. This HBD bibliography is, I don't know, 50 screens long of articles that they have cataloged and collected in all these categories. You see the sections here on the right. Where their idea is they're doing an encyclopedic gathering and curation of data so that people can red pill themselves, right? See that little arrow goes ready to take the red pill. So the idea here is that these are the tools you need to see underneath the artifice of today's multicultural, social constructionist and cultural Marxist reality that your college professors are trying to tell you. This is the real story, right? And human biological diversity is a gathering of this hereditarian, either directly racial hereditarian research like your Rushtons and your Jensens and so forth, or just wider range of evolutionary psychology, behavioral genetics arguments about the inheritance of human behaviors. And the cognitive style here, so the purposes are of autodidacticism, right? If the culturally Marxist academy, all that in quote marks, and your politically correct professors won't tell you the truth, then you can teach yourself the truth about racial hereditarianism. And the cognitive style here is to accumulate a giant corpus of decontextualized mainstream science, flawed racial science and political writing, ignore and dismiss any of the critiques of this stuff, and then treat genetically determined racial differences in behavior as a kind of forbidden knowledge. That's obviously true, but it's being suppressed by the academic left. And this carries out, so some of this is passive, right? So it's these resources that you're supposed to take and sort of teach yourself, but then there's also an industry of human biodiversity blogs, which, because we're past the kind of blog era, there's less activity in this than there was in previous eras. But here's an example of one called the alternativehypothesis.org, and they identify one of many dozens of blogs of this type, where they talk about topics such as ethnic diversity, race, crime, race and intelligence. And this site is mostly in the business of making factual statements and empirical arguments. As such, it is only racist to the degree that facts and numbers are racist. So what they're trying to do is align themselves with science and say, like, well, maybe science is racist, but I'm not racist, right? This is just about truth. And you can see here what they have done is created an essay. There's a whole essay that goes along with this that looks at different genetic variants and then looks at associations with intelligence, or these positive or negative associations with intelligence of these genetic variants in some behavior genetics study. And then they look at the different rates of these in different racial groups to make an argument that, like Blacks have a bunch of the, higher saturation of the negative genes for intelligence and lower saturation of the positive genes, or lower frequencies. Right? So this is the kind of argument that's being made. And so human biodiversity, it's ironic, because this is a phrase coined, I mentioned Jonathan Marks before, coined by the anti-racist anthropologist in his 1994 book. And he writes in an editorial on his blog that human biodiversity was intended as an alternative way of talking about human variation without the overarching assumption that our species sorts into fairly discrete, fairly homogeneous races. So he introduced the term as an alternative to talk about human differences without using races. But this has been appropriated in the late 1990s by racists who saw it as a more genteel and sciencey way to simply say race. And human biological diversity investigative journalists have shown that this sphere of ideas has infiltrated the Trump administration and some of the UK Tories. Prominently for us, Stephen Miller was a commentator. Stephen Miller, the architect of Donald Trump's immigration policy and restrictions. The cages at the southern border he was influenced by this movement. And it's gone from being a pseudoscientific appropriation to actually an ideological rallying cry. And I just give this this extreme manifestation of its use in the manifesto by the El Paso shooter from last August. this past August. 2019, the man who went and shot about 30 people in a Walmart parking lot in El Paso, Texas, he released a manifesto, and he wrote this inconvenient truth, right, riffing off of course, Al Gore's book, His Inconvenient Truth. And he writes that the Hispanic community was not his target before he read The Great Replacement, which is this book by Renard Camus, which is a merging of alt-right ideas and white nationalist ideas. And he says that I'm against race mixing because it destroys genetic diversity and creates identity problems. So in this manifesto, it's not deep in the manifesto, but in this manifesto, he invokes the ideas that are discussed in the human biological diversity movement and invokes them as justification for his murderous rampage. So there's a merging here of alt-right metapolitics and white nationalist terrorism. Okay. So now I'm going to try to head into the last section of the talk, which is about the emerging racist counterscience. So this is the most intensive level of appropriation of science by white nationalists. And here I'm going to be talking about a cadre of autodidacts and graduate students and their allies who have attempted to exploit the open science resources of the academy to do things like basically download genetic data sets, write their own papers, and publish them in order to make racial hereditarian arguments. And so, true or false, these efforts aim to make novel intellectual contributions. They aim to do science in the service of racial hereditarianism. So, for example, you get this article by Kierkegaard and First about inequality in the US, and they're arguing that racial admixture is the cause of inequality. They published this in the Mankind Quarterly. Another article was about biogeographic ancestry and socioeconomic outcomes. An article in this journal called Open Behavioral Genetics about the nature of race. In this journal called Psych in 2019, the effects of biracial status and color on crystallized intelligence in the US-born African Americans. So there's a set of these articles that these folks are producing, and this is just a small subset. We go on and on about these that are aiming to produce scientific articles with an abstract and findings and a literature review and the whole thing. And sometimes they even get into journals like the journal Intelligence, which is the sort of leading journal of psychological research on intelligence. This gentleman, David Piffer, basically wrote an article that tried to correlate national polygenic risk scores to national IQ levels, right? This sort of ecological analysis of polygenic scores for IQ and national IQ levels. And he's found a linear relationship. And so on the one hand, these folks, how are they doing this? So on the one hand, they're capitalizing on old resources, such as you saw Mankind Quarterly, right? So most of you probably are aware that Mankind Quarterly is a notorious journal of racist psychology and anthropology. It's been around for about 50 or 60 years, maybe 60 or 70 years. And it's been doing this stuff forever. So some of it is publishing in there. Capitalizing, right, so that's Mankind Quarterly. The Ulster Institute for Social Research is run by Richard Lynn, who I talked about earlier on, and it's devoted to studying things like national IQ and eugenics and so forth. And so a lot of these folks have gotten sort of fellowships at this Ulster Institute, so they've capitalized on these old resources, but they've also tried to, oh yes, and sorry, this is a little bit out of order. They've also worked by founding their own journals. So starting a set of open science journals that are open peer reviewed, and they're all the editors and they're mostly the peer reviewers, but they invite other people to submit stuff to these journals. They also have tried to work in collaboration with some older established folks that are interested in hereditary psychology, and there was a conference that was at the University College of London that was sort of scandalously exposed a couple of years ago, in which a lot of these folks were meeting and under the auspices of the University College London. And these journals, so the thing is, these journals are often criticized as kind of vanity publications, but they are engaging in all the trappings of peer-reviewed science, right? So they're in some ways much more open than ordinary journals, right? So they do all the peer reviewing out in open. There's no anonymity. If you wanted to comment on any of the people who are publishing on these articles, you could join the open peer review before these articles are published, and they respond to their critics and go back and forth. And so they are really doing a very open science idea of science. And then, of course, though, they have also published in some mainstream psychology journals. So I talked about Intelligence a minute ago, but also this journal, Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences, which is an APA journal, has featured articles by these guys. So Kierkegaard, Woodley, and Paulson, in particular, are longstanding members of this sort of circle of amateur publishers, amateur white nationalist publishers. And then they finally have engaged in kinds of recruitment efforts, right? So I got an article, an email a couple years ago at this point, 2 years ago at this point, basically asking if I would be willing to submit an article to an open forum that they were going to have about an infamous paper by Arthur Jensen and Phil Brushon. And the idea wasn't that I would publish something that was, copacetic with their ideas, but that I, as a UCLA professor who has been, who wrote a book about this stuff more broadly, would engage them in a kind of conversation and debate in a way that even if I was critical of them, it would be a legitimation, I think, of their point of view, and show why they have to be taken seriously. Okay, and so, oh, sorry, I have this kind of I wanted to put this, sorry, this is out of order. And so I wanted to close by talking a little bit about open and closed evidential cultures. Harry Collins, a sociologist of science, wrote basically a paper about how different scientific communities decide what is publishable. And he talked about how different communities have different thresholds of evidentiary significance and different levels of rigor of evidence that they agree are a publishable unit. And they also have different ideas about who takes responsibility for the validity and the meaning of research results. So in closed cultures, in closed academic cultures, it's supposed to be the individual research group that takes responsibility for what's true. And in an open culture, it's the field, right? So in an open research culture, you can kind of publish lots of ideas, whether or not they're like fully justified and all the I's are dotted and T's crossed. It's okay, even if that's not all taken care of, because the community or the field itself will take responsibility for this. And you can see evidence that like the editor of Intelligence, Richard Heyer, is interested or sees his purpose as fostering an open evidential culture, right? So he says, yeah, sure, there are a lot of people that have sort of said provocative kind of racial or racist things that want to publish in my journal, and he decided that it's better to deal with these things through sunlight and inclusion. The relationship between intelligence and group differences, meaning racial differences, is the most incendiary idea incendiary area in the whole of psychology. And he says, I prefer to let the papers and the data speak for themselves. So let's just publish these papers, and then the community of scientists can decide what to do about them. And so you can see that happen in this paper, right, that I mentioned above, where Dunkel et al., these individuals, basically publish on the right. You can see this is the sort of main graph. And again, it's not a totally ecological analysis here, but basically they say that the Christian, and they use a data set from the Wisconsin longitudinal social science study, right? A major data set that has this polygenic data involved in rich sociological, as well as rich sociological variables. And they downloaded those data, and they published an article that basically says the distribution for the polygenic risk score for intelligence for Jews and Christians is very different. And the distribution of IQ on the bottom here is very different for them as well. And so their argument was that there's probably, a reason for the average high cognitive ability of Jews, right? Which is so this may on the one hand seem counterintuitive for a white nationalist, but part of the white nationalist discourse is an anti-Semitic discourse about the devious intelligence of people of Jewish descent, right? And so this fits in with that picture, even if it seems to show that Jews are superior, at least on genetics of IQ here. And sorry, going back here. And so my argument is that that some of this might be about dissident professionals in the old days, but it's also about a vulnerable evidential culture. That the evidential culture that people like Richard Heyer and many psychology journals seem to have promulgated seems to be vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. And so the scientific collective, as Collins suggested, has responded to this paper. So the Jeremy Fries is the lead author on this paper. He's the guy who basically runs the Wisconsin survey. And the response was basically this, that if you take the argument seriously of what they're saying, the average Jewish polygenic score is really up here. And if you regress the polygenic score by intelligence and get the linear relationship, Jews should have 4.5 standard deviations further to the right on intelligence. But actually they're just a quarter, or a half standard deviation higher than the mean. And so what they're saying is that this is a clear, the response in this paper is that this is a clear sign of population stratification and why you can't use polygenic risk scores to do direct comparisons of groups with different ancestry backgrounds, right? That you just can't, it's not an apples to apples comparison. There's another explanation here, and it's population stratification, right? And so, great, they responded, they showed that the paper was wrong, but this is at some level an open evidentiary culture functioning as it should. But the problem is, from my point of view, and I think from a lot of people's point of view, and we should think about, is that scientists aren't the only audience here, right? So if it was only a conversation among scientists within the ivory tower, okay, it's embarrassing, it's dumb, it's maybe a waste of people's time, but it's not that big a deal. But the point is, I've given you a whole long paper about how they're not the audience, right? The audience is this incredible field of interest and engagement. And so putting these ideas out there and legitimating them one way or the other, and certainly the sort of the critical argument doesn't have to be circulated on the human biodiversity blogs and websites, becomes a real problem. Okay, so I'm sorry I've gone kind of long here, but let me conclude by summarizing and saying that I think explicit scientific racism is arguably at an all-time low in academic and professional science. But a dispersed and non-professional citizen movement has come to fill in this vacuum, right? And it's not just about the passive consumption and misinterpretation of pre-existing ideas. It's also about a dynamic scientific practice that at least aims to produce new knowledge that's wedded to an inegalitarian politics of social injustice. There's a wide range of participatory practices that range from scientific journalism all the way to this kind of emergent counterscience and allegiance with some established scientific or legitimate established scientific parties. And there's a wide range of expertise from like the common sense. Well, this is a reference to literature I haven't really reviewed, but from sort of common sense expertise to very contributory expertise, aiming to contribute to the scientific discourse. There's a kind of sophomoric cognitive style. On the one hand, a combination of technical sophistication, right? These dudes are really good at running regressions in Excel and even R, but also decontextualization of these ideas and then appeals to common sense, right? An appeal to things like correlation, repeated correlations being evidence of causation and so forth, right? Even though scientists and statisticians would reject that kind of argument, it's the kind of argumentative style that's made. And then finally, an exploitation of open science, both the infrastructure, the ideology of open science, and also the evidentiary cultures that are relatively open. These folks have, on the one hand, both a substantive aim of racial realism and demonstrating hereditary explanations for racial differences. That's the sort of substantive aim of these folks, right? And demonstrating that again and again in all these different ways. But they also have a meta-political aim of challenging the horizon of legitimate discourse, right? And so this goes back to the first point up here at the top, which is they're trying to reinsert the legitimacy of these delegitimated ideas. It's a meta-political aim too, which is doing things like showing that the politically correct academy is intellectually bankrupt, is co-opted by cultural Marxists and so forth. And championing ideas of true diversity that include whiteness, true intellectual freedom, and heterodox thinking, which are core values of science, right? These are the kinds of things that they try to promulgate through these different examples. And then finally, they're training a cadre, right? They're building an intellectual archive of resources, and they're training people how to think about them and how to engage them in ways that are not being matched by the left. Or even by the sort of center. Are we teaching our students to be able to directly engage and falsify these kinds of ideas? Or do we teach them, race is socially constructed because of history and politics? Okay, and finally, I think that this produces a set of explanatory and political challenges for us as sociologists, as anthropologists, as psychologists engaging here. What are the proper tactics? Is this a misappropriation of our fields, or what happens when these misappropriations appear in our legitimate scientific journals, like the examples that I gave? How do we draw the proper boundaries? Okay, so I'll stop there. Thank you for letting me go on. And thank you to my co-authors, my research team, and my funders. And thanks, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks so much for a great talk. Really fascinating. We have some time for discussion. Before we do that, Aaron, did I make you host? Are you host?
Oh.
Maybe if you make me host again, I can see the hands raised. And
okay, how do I do that? Let's see.
I think it's under, oh, that's a good question. How did I make you the co-host?
Make host. I think I did it.
Okay.
Are you the host again?
I'm not even sure how I see that, but let's see. So maybe if you unshare your screen, I'll be able to see everyone. And then what I'll do is I'll just a reminder for people who might be new, on your Zoom window under participants, if you go down under participants and click on that, you'll be able to see on the right-hand side a raise hand option. And hopefully I'll be able to see.
So you're the co-host at least.
Okay.
Clark, I think the raise hand option has been disabled.
Okay. Yeah, and we can still see your screen, Aaron.
Okay. How do I? This is not letting me.
Multiple participants. That might help.
I'm sorry.
There's raised hand under reactions if you have reactions.
Ah.
Where's
On my screen,
yeah, there's a yellow hand.
I can see raised hand under participants. If you go to participants and then.
I don't know.
So I will take a list of people. Aaron, if I may.
I'm trying to figure out how to unshare here.
Yeah.
I don't know why this is not. Oh wait, I know why. Wrong screen.
You may have multiple. Yeah, because I just see the background screen.
Okay, there's the two screen thing.
Excellent.
Okay.
Great. Before we start with the questions, I wonder if I might ask a question, just because you alluded to this at the beginning of your talk. And that is, so my question, I realize, doesn't have any objective right answer, but I'm curious about your opinion about the sort of demarcation of science in this domain, because you mentioned that sometimes when you've given your talk, one of the pushbacks is, well, this is just misappropriation of science, but it's not actual science. But as we know in the philosophy of science, right, it's this question of what counts as science is a very difficult one to answer. And I was just curious, about your opinion, how to think about this, because you mentioned so many cases where you're saying that these are talented people who do regressions and they use raw data and they may even be able to publish in somewhat reputable journals. How do you think about it as a sociologist?
Yeah, I mean, so as a sociologist, I mean, I think that like I don't super have standing to decide what's real science in this area because I don't do this work. I mean, I have my opinions. I can run through some of the criticisms of the things. I think there's a lot of reliance on ecological analysis, and by which I mean, this group of people have this trait and this other, in these two domains, but does the low sort of IQ of Zimbabwe and the low polygenic score of Zimbabwe mean, so there's that kind of analysis. There's a lot of correlation kind of arguments in this stuff, and there's a lot of sort of repetition and correlation. So I think I can talk about the cognitive style and the set of arguments that they make, which is not one that that I think that most of you in this room adhere to. It's not ones of my colleagues in public policy or geneticists that I know, but I also feel like some of this stuff is slipping through, if we want to call it that. So I actually, this is one of the reasons why I was eager to talk to you. Like, what do you guys think about this stuff showing up in I forget what the name of that journal, Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences.
Yeah,
I would imagine that this is a journal that some of you have published in, or at least have read and cite sometimes. What do we make of this? So
yeah, there was another controversy in that very journal recently that some of us, sort of saw happening online with a eugenics type of argument. So there's something about that journal where they're not. Yeah,
I mean, there's something. I think it's one thing I would have said is like, the recent move towards the reproducibility sort of efforts to govern reproducibility crisis is, I think, in some ways about changing the evidentiary culture of psychology, and in some sense closing it down, tightening it down to some degree, making individual parties more responsible for the integrity of their research, and also using transparency and openness, some open architectures to help do that. But it's also partly a cultural thing, right? About what's the threshold and who's responsible. And so the editors of a couple of these journals seem to have that other idea, that sort of open idea, like, let's just put the ideas out there and then people can sort of let the chips fall where they may. But that is, I think, it's politically dangerous at this time.
Yeah. Good point. Okay, let me open it up to some questions because I can see the blue hands now. So first we have Carol Browner.
Okay.
Hi, Carol.
Hi, that was really, hi. That was an interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I was sorry, well, not sorry, but you passed over kind of quickly the idea that there are similar movements elsewhere in Europe, white nationalist movements. And I was wondering if you could talk about the extent to which they exactly mimic what we see in the US. Maybe they have a longer history. I don't know if this is something that you've actually looked into, but I was interested in a comparison.
Yeah. So the main thing I could say is I can't say too much about it because I haven't studied the Europeans that directly. I was relying on a talk that I heard by my colleague Claude Olivier Doron mainly for that stuff. The main differences that I seem to see, and I should speak with him in more detail. Maybe we can collaborate on something. Are that in the U.S. the white nationalists are not concerned about different kinds of whiteness, right? So there's not a concern with. People of Mediterranean ancestry versus people of Nordic or English ancestry or anything like that. There's whites, Jews, blacks, Hispanics, Asian, right? So there's sort of that constellation, and that's the question. And I think what Doron has shown is that in Europe, there's less concern about the color line and more concern, even though there is concern, right? And they do make arguments like, oh, you know, are we all really all out of Africa and so forth? So there is definitely a race dimension and a European versus African dimension, but it's much more caught up on the question of intra-European comparisons and legitimacy over who has sort of standing in Europe. That would be the basic difference.
Great. So next we have a question from Dan.
Hey, Aaron, thanks.
Hey, Dan.
Really interesting stuff. You know, the unfair question from the bleachers is always, well, fine, that's what you do, but what about something that you don't do? And I'm going to ask you about that.
Okay.
And that's, you know, how much do the patterns that you've documented parallel those that we see in, for example, the anti-vaxxer movement or the anti-anthropogenic climate change movement, right? Is this, you know, independent sort of, you know, convergent cultural evolution given the affordances of the internet, right? And how much of this, you know, more broadly is just the dark side of the democratization of knowledge, right? That there is no truth once everyone gets a voice in some ways.
Yeah. So I think what I would say is it's 80% parallel, right? So I think a lot of it is, so I think the gathering of the sort of human biodiversity movement version of it, which is the sort of gathering of the real facts and alternative knowledge on this. And then the ideological idea that there's a suppressed truth that they don't want you to know, and it's a different day and different time. So for the anti-vaxxers, it's the big pharma and the government and so forth. That stuff is the same. I think that the where it goes. So I think the two basic differences are the multivalence of this, the sort of completeness, the ecological completeness of this movement in tackling all these different outlets and all these different tactics and strategies, and then the efforts to actually publish, right? And the sort of open science affordances of downloading the data, running your own regressions, writing your own papers, making your own journals. There's a little bit of that in the intelligent design community, but not too much of those guys end up publishing in, you know, evolutionary biology journals, right? So there's a little bit of that parallel counterscience, but the way in which that they have been able to exploit the fuzziness of this border and the heterodoxy of some scientists in this domain, I think that's unique. So I'm not sure if that's satisfying.
No, yeah, absolutely. That draws the contrasts and the similarities usefully. Just picking up on that and what Clark said earlier, I mean, looking at it through the eyes of a sociologist, which I am not, I think one of the inherent liabilities of evolutionary science, evolutionary psychology, of which evolutionary behavioral science, the journal you cited, is you know, one venue, is that it has always had a heterodox orientation to conventional social science, right? And that you know, a tendency to kind of circle the wagons among the evolutionists and to disparage mainstream social science, and that provides an affordance on those venues that wouldn't necessarily be there, you know, when you're talking to immunologists about vaccines or, you know, climatologists about climate change or something like that.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. And my earlier book about behavioral genetics sort of tells a similar story about the sort of how a heterodox orientation has these sort of sociological effects on how a field is organized, and then that conditions how future controversies are responded to. And I think that that's going on here. And so it's difficult because you can't just, like, I don't know. I mean, I think I tell the story in you're saying it becomes a difficult it becomes a difficult sort of controversy management problem. And what is the real orientation of the field, and how do you deal with intellectual diversity that occurs in all fields?
Great, thanks. Next we have a question from Molly.
Hi, thank you for such a fascinating talk, and it's very thought-provoking. One thing that came up for me was this interesting argument you were making about whether these papers should or shouldn't be included in the academic literature, just like you were talking about. And I was thinking about some of the dangers of excluding papers like this, because it then, sort of prohibits counter arguments and also endorses this community's belief that they're being unfairly silenced. And I guess what I was thinking is how, when you have a large academic or scientific literature, there will be papers in that literature, say it's all on one topic, that did all of the statistics correctly, and yet came to a conclusion that is scientifically incorrect, even though it is observationally correct in that cohort for spurious reasons. And when we have these like p-value thresholds, we say that, well, within a reasonable guess, this is probably true, like a 5% chance that this is due to randomness. And that 5% exists. If you had 100 papers on the topic, you might expect, so let's say it was a topic that endorses some racist ideology, you might expect that 5% of those, or the question's racist construct, that 5% actually might demonstrate an endorsement of a racist idea, not because that idea is true, but just because of the randomness of data. And so my question about excluding these papers, I felt that you were maybe implying that the papers themselves were giving analyses, that that if we looked at some paper that purports something racist, if we only redid the statistical analysis more rigorously, we would find the scientific truth to be that they were incorrect. But there will potentially be instances where the stats are all right and they did everything right, and it is a sort of scientifically valid publishable paper, but it endorses an idea that we're uncomfortable with because we think it's scientifically untrue. And I wonder whether we should, I don't really know the answer. I wonder whether we should be excluding these papers actually based on our moral ideas about this topic and not about the sort of lack of academic rigor. I wonder if you can comment on any of that.
Yeah, this is hard, right? Because I don't know. So a couple things, so I think that one so the book that I mentioned, I totally suggest that everyone read this little short book, What is Science Racist, by Jonathan Marks, that I mentioned before, because he does a nice comparison with intelligent design, or with the sort of creationists, and he basically says, scientists have figured out a way to bar this stuff from legitimately being published, and it's because they believe that it isn't a framework of fantasy, and even if they go through the motions of science, it's not science. And his argument is that this is what race science is, that ultimately, if race is it's an ontological myth, it's not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, even if we can find, some statistical evidence for this, it's fundamentally on a fantasy basis. So his argument is we should, if we handle it in one case, we should be able to handle it in the same case. So I'm not in this field, so I don't really know if this, if everyone would agree with that kind of framework. But I guess the point is that, so I guess the point that I'm making is that some people think that this can be handled. It's definitely handled differently in different fields, and different fields have different cultures of evidentiary stuff. I think it is evidentiary cultures that I described before. I think it's undeniable that this has gone way down in genetics, and it has gone down less in psychology and evolutionary psychology allied sciences. And so why is that? Is it true in psychology but not in genetics? Is race real in one domain but not another? Anyway, so it strikes me that there are some counterexamples that suggest that it can be handled differently, that are different examples than that we just have a horizon of facts and horizon of false data. We have bell curves, and statistically speaking, you're going to get false positives sometimes. I think that there's a different argument, right? So it's not like you get 5% of, right? It's handled differently in different fields. So that would kind of be my argument, that we think differently about what our evidentiary standards are and the affordances and who's responsible for bad papers that are decided to be bad later on. I'm not sure that that's a good answer for you, but.
No, thank you. It's interesting.
Yeah, we could talk more some other time. Yeah.
I mean, just one thing I would insert there too, you know, following up on Molly's question is, and you alluded to this, Aaron, in your talk, is that some of the discourse that sometimes is used to get some of this stuff into journals is a kind of just the facts discourse, right? That there's this idea that you can have information that's just purely factual that lacks all political implications or something like that. And I just see that all the time in my field, you know, in evolutionary psychology, as an argument that people make for, look, I did the statistics right, I did it all right. You might not like what I'm saying, but you have to publish it because it's factual. And I mean, to me, as an evolutionary psychologist, I feel like that's something we need to push back on, because, you know, that you have to just ask the question, is there such a thing as politics-free facts, or is there such a thing as implication-free facts? Because if, you know, that's what that argument is predicated on.
Right. We're interested in the question. We're interested in the question in the first place for some reason, right? And it's right. There's infinite questions we could be asking, but we're always asking a small subset of them for some reason.
Yep, absolutely. And that does also bring to mind sometimes when you read these papers in places like EBS, like, why is person X doing this research, right? Given all the things that you could study, it's an interesting sociological question. People that claim to be doing this for neutral reasons, and then it's like, oh, of all the things you could work on, you're totally neutral. You're just interested in the facts, and that's what you chose to study. So I think there's a variety of angles we could take as people, practitioners in this field, to sort of at least open up a space for questioning, you know, how to handle these things as journal editors. Anyway, farther in the queue, we have Andrew Smith.
Hi, thank you for a really, really interesting talk. This is in a space that I've thought a lot about, maybe not necessarily in terms of my own research questions, but just I've sort of worried a lot about it in the past number of years, given sort of the growing presence of the, you know, right online. And just hearing your talk, I think it was interesting to see the perspective that identifies the role of, you know, democratization of knowledge and open science as a potential, you know, pressure point that these kinds of groups could take advantage of. And I guess I'm wondering, you know, to what extent do you think it's the case that the commitment on the side of, you know, practitioners of science to making this information more available is sort of jumping the gun on, you know, increasing scientific literacy and understanding of, like, you know, science as a social process? And a related but sort of orthogonal question is, and this is leveraging some of the things that both Dan and Molly mentioned, is to what extent do you think this is just sort of a reflection of a broader misunderstanding of science as truth guaranteeing versus a process of sort of exploring ideas that are sort of at their core driven by a particular moral stance or perspective or positionality? Like how do you think the misunderstanding of science as a view from nowhere is feeding into this kind of discourse?
Yeah, that's great. So I see sort of two parts to your question. One is like, are we scientists making a mistake by promulgating ideas without also promulgating a huge sort of educational apparatus around them? And then the second part being, is there just a sort of a misunderstanding about the sort of political, like about the view from nowhere, the value neutrality of science that is part of this? I mean, so I think with the second, absolutely. I mean, this is the wedge that these folks often use, yeah, there's the wedge that these folks often use, and so it's a hard one to deal with, because they will argue, well, we're just arguing about facts, but you have already discredited yourself because you admitted you have a political motivation, right? When you criticize me because you start out by saying science is a social enterprise with political values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This was actually, by the way, you know, in my own old research, this was the critique that Richard Lowenton was given when Richard Lowenton and Stephen Jay Gould, when they were making these criticisms of, 50 years ago, a generation of these ideas, and they started out by saying, science is a social enterprise, it has these values embedded in it, we have political motivations. These folks claim to not have political motivations, but they really secretly do. That was always a drag on their critical arguments, at least from the point of view of, I'm not sure what the right thing would have been, because I think they're right in saying that, but it was always a drag on their arguments, and people would always say, oh yeah, Richard Lowenton, he's just saying this because he's a Marxist, right? Or Stephen Jay Gould, he's just a socialist, he doesn't care about true truth. There's always a drag. So I don't know the way out of that, as long as there is this ideology that is widely shared. I do think that sort of idea of an educational mission would be extremely valuable, because I think that the problem with so much about the way the social construction of race is taught, and I try to do this in my own teaching in the Institute for Society and Genetics, so much of the problem about the way that the social construction of race is taught is it's taught as if it's grounded because racial categories have been historically variable, and they have been wedded to these political processes of domination and exploitation and colonialism and slavery throughout time, period. Therefore, race is social construction. Therefore, any genetic or scientific stuff on race is illegitimate. So we can stop our analysis there. But I think that the problem is that once that these guys have just like leapfrogged all that and said, yeah, but okay, but here's my, but I looked at the polygenic score, or hey, I looked at the IQ, I did the ecological analysis, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think a more so the explainer that has to happen has to be at the cutting edge of what genetics does and can't do, what psychology can and can't measure, and then also some explaining about the styles of reasoning that are more and less valid and more and less possible to make inferences about. And I think it's different. Some of it's the statistical kind of stuff that Molly was talking about, right? The rates of false positives and so forth, and what a p equals 0.05 means. But I think some of it is also about the inframing of questions in a set of assumptions about things. And once you start to divide up the world into certain sort of categories, like racial categories, and you start making correlations with them, that's a whole style of reasoning that is different than that needs to be dismantled or not dismantled is not the right word, but unpacked in a way that's even different than talking about statistical rates of reasoning. So I think that educational process should be done, and we should be doing it. And, so last thing I'll say is right after that Amy Harmon article that I referenced early in my talk, which is about white nationalism, she wrote like a series of like 3 articles in a row. One was about that. One was about the geneticists sort of like hemming and hawing and not wanting to respond to her. And then the third article in that sequence was a kid, a high school student who was this Black kid in a high school somewhere, randomly. And he was basically like appealing, who can refute this for me? Like my classmates say all these crazy things. They download all these arguments. They throw them at me on Twitter and so forth. And I have no tools to refute this. Right. And so and for that kid to say like, yeah, but race is socially constructed. Yeah, but history proves like that wasn't the toolkit he needed to battle this off. And so we need to arm people in different ways, I think.
Can I ask just a quick follow up on that?
Sure.
So in thinking about the tools that you could provide consumers of science. One of the other things you said in the course of your talk was really interesting to me, specifically when you mentioned how the people who are sort of promulgating these, vanity publications will reach out in an effort to sort of recruit others to, and in doing that, when people choose to engage, they're sort of endowing them with legitimacy as sort of, people whose ideas are even worthy of sort of sitting at the table. So one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about in these contexts is there are rhetorical techniques that are sort of available to, negating some of these notions. But I wonder also about how, given that there are some traits for which there is a definitive genetic component and the frequency of those traits vary as a function of, racial identity or, ethnic identity or whatever. So something like, hair color or, texture of your hair or whatever, like these are things that have a genetic component, vary in terms of their frequency. Given that those kinds of findings and publications about them can suggest something about like, okay, differences between groups, some differences between groups have a genetic basis. Is there something about the way people tend to think or the kinds of inferences they draw that support thinking about all differences that they understand between groups? And if so, is there rhetorical value in not, basically making these kinds of findings as readily available if it encourages people to generalize the types of conclusions to other traits for which there's no evidence of a genetic basis?
So, I mean, it's hard. It's hard. I mean, I think that at some level that this is a different study than I've done. That would involve a study of what kind of educational messages are lead to what kinds of outcomes. And so that's sort of a different sort of a pedagogical and psychological study about like how do we explain things when all these facts are not like sort of just like in a row, but they also embody different assumptions about what explanation is. To say something is genetic is to make a argument about variation of populations under particular conditions, and it isn't an essentialist claim, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to like have all that sort of framing knowledge in order to make so. So I guess what I would say is like, I don't know the answer for exactly what has to be done, but I think that is a clear project, right, that we should start to undertake, which is like, how do you convey both the mainline findings and the mainline uncertainties, and then also the social uncertainties and the interpretive framework in which you need to bring this up. And some of that interpretive framework is the social stuff we've talked about, which is that science is always done under a condition of curiosity, and curiosity is always conditioned by the world we live in, right? And its political interests and social interests. So like, there's a combination of like these sort of political arguments, statistical arguments, ideological arguments, and conceptual framework arguments that all have to be juggled at once. Super hard.
Cool. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, that's a great note to end on. Molly, do you still have your hand up, or are you?
Well, I had a question, but I think we're out of time. So
okay, I'm happy to talk with people at another time. Please send me emails. I'd love to chat with you.
Great, thank you so much. And so it really great to hear this talk. Thank you for talking to us, Aaron.
Yeah, thank you
for your presentation. And please feel free to come back to Beck anytime. And Hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone, and I'll see you next week for Ev Fedorenko's talk. Let's thank Aaron for a great talk.
Thanks. Appreciate it. I really had a good time.